Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 66 Years of Godzilla panel here at Nexus Con. My name is Matt Burkett. I'm going to be your host for today. And just a real little quick about me. Been a lifelong Godzilla fan for many a years now. I run a YouTube channel solely dedicated to the thing called Monstrosities Tokusatsu Vlog. And I'm a huge fan of anything Japanese, sci-fi, or fantasy related. On November 3rd, 1954, Japanese movie company Toho Studios unleashed Gojira, Godzilla, into Japanese theaters, and things have never really been quite the same. In the almost 66 years of the franchise, Godzilla has become a worldwide phenomenon. He has fans all across the world. He's been in over 30 motion pictures, including several Hollywood adaptations. Today, you're going to be taking a journey through 6 decades worth of movie monster history. And some of your tour guides are going to be those who have either written extensively about the franchise or in some cases even got to work on the movies themselves. And we're going to be going through all 5 eras of Godzilla today. So that means our first stop is all the way back in 1954 with the Showa Series. Now, the Showa Series, which is named after the reign of Japanese Emperor Hirohito, refers to the first 15 Godzilla movies that started in 1954 and went to 1975. These are the classics. These are the ones that introduced everyone to their favorite monsters for the very first time and really set the groundwork as to what would come later on. To talk more about the Showa Series, I reached out to my buddy Norman England. Norman is a writer-photographer who is based in Tokyo, and he's worked in the Japanese film industry for over 20 years. He's also the director of the documentary Bringing Godzilla Down to Size, and the guy has, I think he told me, 150 days logged on Godzilla film sets. But more about that later. The reason why he's going to be talking to you about the Showa Series today is because these are the set of films that made him the lifelong fan that he is today. I'll let him explain.
You know, I was born in 1959. So really for me, my first Godzilla movie was Godzilla 54. Seeing that the US version playing on TV in New York, because I'm from New York. I can't really say like I grew up on Showa movies, because I think that the way fandoms were back then was, you know, it wasn't like these separate little niches. It was all part of one thing. You know, that's why you see a lot of the older people, they call themselves monster kids. Even like my t-shirt, this is from Invaders from Mars, you know, from the early 50s. I mean, they all felt like they were all part of the same family. You know, I like some more than others, but, you know, I had love for all of the stuff in the genre because it was all imaginative. It was all full of really cool looking creatures and designs. But I have to say, in particular, though, I really did like, you know, Godzilla. And as more films were coming over to the US, because it generally take like, I guess, 2 years to reach the US side. Some of the films that I saw in the theater, well, I know I saw Destroy All Monsters on TV, and that was always a big thing. Like all my friends, Destroy All Monsters is going to be on TV on Saturday, and there was nothing more important than watching that film, because that movie had everything. I saw War of the Gargantuas in the theater, and Son of Godzilla in the theater, and I saw Godzilla's Revenge 3 times in the theater. The thing that was different about those films from the US films was, you know, of course, you know, the suits. We don't have really, you know, of course, you know, we have suits in US films like something like It, you know, the Terror from Beyond Space, or things like Hideous Sun Demon in the 50s, you know, the Metaluna. I mean, those are all suits, but that whole like giant monster thing with the miniature stuff around it, you know, it was very appealing. It was very wonderful, especially on a giant screen. I think a lot of like the younger fans or the later generation fans were introduced to Godzilla on VHS tapes, you know, DVDs, laser discs and stuff like that. And so their first exposure to Godzilla was on a small screen. I mean, for me, the same thing too, because I saw 54 Godzilla on TV, but as soon as those were coming to the theater, I'm at the theater, and man, I mean, that's like, I think everybody who's a Godzilla fan has seen Godzilla in the theater, but it's a much different experience. So I would say that was probably the really wonderful thing about being a Godzilla fan, in the 60s, in the 70s, was seeing these films, being introduced to these films by going to the theater, by being able to really appreciate all the miniature work that was being done. A lot of the people that were distractors, back then, were really not seeing them in the theaters where they really come to life. They were seeing them, in photos, not familiar with them, scoffing at them because it's ridiculous, and they're really missing the point of these films. And if I had to say one other point that I think was really good about not just the kaiju films in general, but all of films that were, say, fantasy driven back then, was they didn't really have to be realistic. I watch films today and they're so afraid to be accused of being unrealistic. So there's all this like pseudoscience, to prop up the idea, but it's just, for me, it's just no fun. I mean, they're all not real, so that's why I kind of prefer the old Showa movies, because they really were like a spectacle, and they really gave you so much. They were fun, they were entertaining, they were colorful, the music was exciting, they were sprawling epics for kids. Speaking of like favorites in the Showa period, it's a little difficult for me to say, I like this one, I like this one, and I don't want to say like, oh, I love them all because I love Godzilla. Of course, it's got highs and lows and stuff, but it's really like, when these things were coming out, they were coming out at us, one by one. So we were digesting them each on their own merits. And, the series was really developing at the time. 54 is like in a category all its own. It's very difficult to compare 54 to any of the other films. 54 Godzilla is kind of like this untouchable thing. And I like the 54 Godzilla, but when I want to enjoy Godzilla, it's not my go-to film. When I have friends over, we want to sit down and watch a Godzilla movie. No one's like, put 54 on, because it's kind of a bleak movie, but it's a very well-made movie. I love the movie. Godzilla Raids Again, the next one, or Gigantus the Fire Monster, that was what we called it back then. I mean, that movie's a bore. I hope to never see it again. Then other things really changed, like especially King Kong versus Godzilla, when that played in the US, and that was on TV a lot. I mean, that movie was really very, colorful and very wild and funny and bizarre. That was a film that really increased the fan base. And the same thing with Godzilla versus Mothra. Then, this Godzilla versus Mothra comes out, taking, the Mothra film and combining these two characters together, and that was also spectacular. I mean, that's like a real peak in the genre. And then, the film started coming out more and more, and the balance was getting a little weird. Son of Godzilla was another film that is, I'm a big fan of Spiga. I'm a big fan of Gimantis. Those things are like, I've had arguments. I had an argument with director Shusuke Kaneko about the Gimantis, because I was lobbying him personally to have Gimantis appear in his GMK film. And I remember having dinner one night, and me and his son, Suzuyuki, were like just going, we're at his home going, Gimantis, Gimantis, Gimantis. It was Kamikiri, Kamikiras in Japanese, but we're going, Kamikiras. And he's like, it's not a kaiju, it's just a praying mantis. But I'm like, that's the beauty of Gimantis. Destroy All Monsters was wonderful. And I have to say, Godzilla versus Hedra was another film that really a lot of like fans my age back in school, that was covered in Famous Monsters magazine. The photographs were wonderful. Back then the relationship between the fan and the movie was very different from today, because we didn't have the internet. Stuff was really like out there. Normal people did not watch Godzilla, and kind of Godzilla becoming mainstream is really just a result of the 2014 film. And I don't care what anybody else says, it's always been kind of a side thing. Well, the importance of the Showa series to Godzilla is, I mean, Showa set the tone for everything. You know, Godzilla is Showa. I don't care what anybody says. Everything was created in the Showa period. You know, the use of miniatures, how the miniatures were shot in the show, you know, shot for Godzilla. I worked on several Godzilla movies in Japan. I mean, I was more like a set interloper. Toho allowed me to be on the set freely. I had an open door policy at Toho, so I was at Toho throughout the Millennium series. I tallied it up recently, 150 days I spent on the Godzilla sets during the Millennium series, and it's a big chunk of 5 years of my life. And you know, one of the things, you know, when I talked to the staff back then, and there were still guys, there was especially there was one guy still that had started on King Kong versus Godzilla. And I asked him too, specifically, what's the difference between now and the Tsuburaya era? He said nothing. It's still basically the same. I mean, it's the same amount of guys doing the same stuff the crew was doing back, you know, in the 60s. That's the thing about Japan. It's a very tradition-based society. So once they come up with a way of doing, they try not to modify it. There's a very strong thread that runs through all of the films. But again, it was all, you know, established during the Showa period.
When the Showa era ended in 1975 with Terror of Mechagodzilla, it would be a decade before Godzilla came back again, and he did that with a movie called Godzilla 1984. This movie kickstarted what would come to be known as the Heisei Godzilla era. This era ran from 1984 to 1995 with a total of 7 films, and is technically a complete reboot to the series. The only film that the Heisei era recognizes as happening within its continuity is the original Godzilla 1954 film. Here to explain further is Patrick Galvan. Patrick has written extensively about the Godzilla series for websites like sci-fi.com and TohoKingdom.com, which is one of the biggest Godzilla fan sites out there. He's also considered by many to be an up-and-coming expert about this particular franchise.
Well, the Heisei series is a very interesting series historically in a lot of respects. Obviously, it was the big reboot for the franchise. You know, this is the series where they attempted to do a strict continuity series where all the films had, like, you know, a quote-unquote logical sequential continuity where all the films followed one another, where all the films directly related to one another. And of course, it was also the series where they did the first full-on retcon of the franchise, where the first film in this series, The Return of Godzilla, also known as Godzilla 84, pretended that all the films between itself and the original Godzilla just never happened. When compared to the Showa films, they are definitely a product of their time, and what I mean by that is they are a byproduct of a time where the Japanese film industry is a much smaller and less prestigious place than what it had been in the 50s and the 60s, and to an extent in the 70s. Back in the old days of Ishiro Honda, Eiji Tsuburaya, Jun Fukuda, etc. and so forth, the Japanese film industry, especially in the 50s, was in very good shape, and the studios were cranking out, you know, dozens of films a year. They not only made a lot of movies back then, but they also put a lot of hard work into making sure that the personnel who were in charge of making these films were, you know, qualified and experienced and, you know, prepared to make well-made, high-quality films. You know, like, for example, like Ishiro Honda, long before he became a filmmaker, he spent many, many years as an apprentice director, you know, studying under his seniors how movies got made. And his seniors would take him under their wing, and they would show him, along with the other trainees, you know, how to make movies, you know, how to write scripts, how to improve stories, how to work with the technicians, how to edit films, how to work out continuity and such. And so, but more to my point, you know, it was made by a generation of filmmakers who had a background in film production, who had spent many years, or months, if not years, learning their craft, and so they were very well equipped to make, you know, high quality films. But when the film industry started to fall apart in the mid to late 60s, and most notably in the 70s, Toho started to downsize. Even though the film industry rebounded in the 1980s with a bubble economy, at the same time, artistically, the industry did not fully recover. And so you started to get all these people put in charge of making these films who were very inexperienced and underqualified. The example I always go to is Takao Okawara. Okawara, who directed Godzilla vs. Mothra 92, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 93, Godzilla vs. Destroya, and later Godzilla 2000, he came from a very different kind of background than, say, Honda. Whereas Honda had spent many years actively learning how to become a filmmaker, Okawara's only real experience with making movies beforehand was that he'd basically been an errand boy. He basically spent a lot of time on film sets just, watching how films got made. And his only responsibilities were things like, making sure the actors showed up on time, telling people to quiet down for the first take. And while that's certainly better than nothing, it's not the same thing as, being actively trained over many years in how to become a filmmaker. While they had the resources to make great Godzilla films, they did not have the personnel to make great Godzilla films. And while the films, I think, are watchable enough and, enjoyable enough if you don't demand much from them, they definitely do represent, in general, a downgrade in quality from what had come before them. The Heisei series definitely started out pretty good in the 80s because you had Tanaka was still the guy in charge, and he was still definitely taking an active role in these films. Godzilla 84 was basically like his big pet project because he'd been trying to reboot Godzilla for years, and Godzilla was finally serious again, and he had a very large budget to work with. And I think it definitely shows in the movie because, you can definitely see the money on the screen. And one interesting detail about Godzilla 84 is that while it is kind of known as the beginning of the Heisei series, it is by technicality a Showa film because it was made when Hirohito was still Emperor of Japan. That's how Japan's eras get named, after the person who's emperor at the time. And Hirohito was still emperor at the time Godzilla 84 was made, so by technicality, it's a Showa film still. I think it's also it's fitting in that sense because it aesthetically has much more in common with the Showa films than the films that came afterwards. It was made by Hashimoto, who was Honda's former assistant. You had Terushi Nakano still doing the special effects. He had done the special effects for the Godzilla films in the 70s. Whereas the films that came afterwards, beginning with Godzilla vs. Biollante, they were made by a very definite post-war generation of filmmakers who would, be the guys putting these films together, henceforth. So definitely, I would say the return of Godzilla and Godzilla vs. Biollante are definitely the high points of the series and also the most important historically for what they did. In terms of the historical importance, if I were to name a third film, I would actually pick one that most people don't really talk about and is usually kind of regarded as even amongst Heisei fans, as kind of a low entry in the series, and that would be Godzilla vs. Mothra 92. While it's definitely not my favorite of the films that came out in that era, I think it's actually the most historically important because that was the point where Shogo Tomiyama had the idea of giving these films to Takao Okawara. And Okawara essentially became the go-to director for these films going forward. He did not make Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla because he was occupied making another film at the time, but he directed all but one of the Heisei films that came after that. And it was because Godzilla vs. Mothra 92 was a huge box office hit. It was the big hit that Toho had wanted from Godzilla from the Heisei series since the beginning. Because Godzilla 84 and Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah had done pretty good, all things considered, but neither of them were through-the-roof hits. And Biollante, unfortunately, did not do all that spectacular. But Godzilla vs. Mothra was a huge sensation. I think it sold like 4.2 million tickets, which is a lot more successful than any Godzilla film after it, with the exception of Shin Godzilla. And I'm not counting the Hollywood films when I say that. I think the Heisei series, its main importance, I would say, is that, especially with Mothra 92, they had Godzilla films that were definitely in the mainstream public eye. Because of that, you had a new generation of people who became exposed to Godzilla. And the same was true also in America. Once the films eventually came to the United States, there were gobs of people who grew up with the Heisei series. And it marked the last time that a generation of Godzilla films had a mainstream audience. Because the Millennium films, by and large, did not do all that spectacular at the box office. And Shin Godzilla was a huge hit, but it was a solo film. Again, qualitatively, they are all over the place. I'd say, from a historical perspective, in terms of keeping Godzilla alive, at least for a short while, and for introducing a whole new generation of fans, they have a very important place in the franchise. And I think on that level, they're worthy of some acknowledgement to that extent.
So the Heisei Era concludes in 1995 with Godzilla vs. Destoroyah, and it sets the stage for the very first Hollywood adaptation, a big budget Hollywood movie that would later be released in 1998. This movie, simply titled Godzilla, came out and it was met with super duper sour reviews. Nobody liked it. And truthfully, we could probably film an entire panel talking about this particular movie, but like I said, the most important thing to get out of this movie is that nobody liked it and they wanted their giant rubber-suited monster back. And Toho heeded that call when they released Godzilla 2000 Millennium in 1999. This is what brought about the Millennium series of films, which again started in 1999 and went to 2004. Continuity-wise, each movie serves as a sequel to 1954, but each movie, with the exception of two, is its own separate continuity and they're not interlinked with each other. I'm going to have Norman England actually talk about the Millennium series again for you because Norman, the lucky guy, actually got to work on a number of these movies during this time.
I live in Tokyo and school just got let off. I don't know if you can hear all those kids out there. My greatest involvement with the Godzilla series happened during the Millennium series, which is really like the tail end of Godzilla as we used to know it. My experience on the set of the Millennium series was a very wonderful experience. You know, I went to Godzilla 2000 covering that for Fangoria magazine, and that was my first time to visit the Godzilla set. And I mean, I remember, you know, walking up to the big pool, you know, Godzilla's out there. It was just starting to rain, so the staff had to quickly wrap Godzilla in plastic, and everyone rushed over to Studio 9. But I was like, oh my God, this is so incredible. Godzilla's right there, and going in, and then I watched them shoot the headlight scenes when near the beginning of the film, when like the Godzilla crew, whatever, is like beaming their headlights on Godzilla. It was like the most incredible thing I'd ever seen. But I was so inexperienced with the Godzilla set at that point. Then after that, next year, I was on Mega Giras, you know, and I was getting familiar with Toho. And then really it was like with GMK, where GMK director Shusuke Kaneko invited me, you know, just here, hang out on the set. You know, I'm doing my Fangoria piece. I was also doing Kaneko's website back then. And then Toho asked me to do a thing called the Norman Report, which was every 2 weeks I would write something for their Godzilla website, talking about a staff person I had a nice conversation with, what I was seeing on the set. And that was really the first time, and I think the only time, that there's ever been like live coverage of a Godzilla production. For me, the big one was GMK. And GMK, I was there just about every single day, going between the live action set and going to the Studio 9. And Studio 9 is where Toho traditionally shoots all their special effects stuff. So I've been involved in other Toho movies, and always when the special effects at Studio 9 or right next door Studio 8, which are the two biggest sound stages at least at the time they were in, I think, all of Asia. They're very huge rooms with tall ceilings, and right outside was the big pool. The big pool no longer exists anymore, because even like on the Millennium series, when I was talking to the special effects director Suzuki, they used to, back in the 60s and even in the 80s, on the Heisei Godzilla, they had painted backdrops. So they had this giant white wall behind it, and they paint the sky and whatever. So when I'm on the Millennium series, they've got a green screen hanging down, the biggest green screen I've ever seen in my life. And I'm like, why the green screen? Why don't you paint it? And Suzuki's like, it's just not going to look real enough for the modern audience. So we've got to digitally put in a screen on the back, which I kind of was saddened by, because I like the painted background stuff. That was kind of, I guess, the signal that even like the pool stuff, they didn't need to have that pool anymore because of advancements in digital cinematography. So the pool's days were numbered, even from the Millennium series, and they had actually shrunk it down by the time I got involved. And some of the staffers would say to me, Norman, I wish you were back here. Especially like Godzilla 85, the pool was like over twice the size it was at during my time at Toho. I mean, those for me were exciting, exciting times because I talk to everybody, I'm friends with everybody, they're letting me have fun on the set. I'm pulling Godzilla's tail, during shots, or I'm helping the art staff make buildings or doing monotonous work like when Godzilla's fighting Ghidra over the pool, like they kind of bash into each other, and the backdrop there, you can see Yokohama City in the backdrop, and I spent hours gluing little colored gels into this. It was like one of those things you see in old cartoons where it's like the city is like, like Batman things were like this, and with just lights on the windows. So they just had like these long boxes which they would put lights in, and then just drill out squares and rectangles for windows. And I spent hours just pasting colored gels on the backs of those, and it looks great on film. I got to wear the Godzilla suit at the end of the shooting. That was really fun. I had guys that were like on the staff saying to me, I've worked 25 years on Godzilla and I've never worn the suit. How come you got to wear the suit? And I said, I asked. I was the same height as the man who plays Godzilla. So Mr. Yoshida, I said, hey man, we're like the same height, because Kitagawa, the guy who was the other Godzilla actor, was shorter than me. I mean, he's a pretty short guy, so there's no way I could fit into his suit. But I was like, okay, Yoshida's like 2 centimeters taller than me. Yeah, I can taller is better than shorter. So, I asked Toho, and Toho said, yeah, we're okay. The front office said, yeah, we're okay if it's okay with Shinada, the suit maker. And Shinada's like, yeah, I'm okay. Like a couple days after wrapping, I went over to Toho. They hauled out the suit. I walked around with it. It was exhausting. It was exciting, as a fan from the 60s, now as an adult, like I'm living in Japan, which I never thought would happen. And it is so pitch black inside. And the interior of the Godzilla suit has got this like super black material. And the only light comes from the little like neck holes in Godzilla. So you can see so you've got this like weird, bizarre mesh in front of you. But it's like, as soon as the light comes in, it's just gone. It's absorbed by the black material. So, I mean, it's like anyone who's got like a touch of claustrophobia is freaking out. I'm freaking out just being in the thing for like the 15 minutes that I was inside the thing. So I don't know how Yoshida did it every day. And my respect level grew for, the suit actor. And I have to say, a lot of people talk about Shin Godzilla, and I am not really a big fan of Shin Godzilla, but it really saddened me that, Toho went the full CG route with that, even though, of course, they used motion capture, but whatever with motion capture. I mean, really, like, that's what that's why I'm so grateful for having been on the Millennium series, because even though Godzilla will probably continue in Japan, they feel that they can't go back to the suits because they got to keep up with Hollywood, which I personally think is a mistake, because you look at those old Showa movies, even the Heisei films, the battle scenes are just wonderful. They're beautiful. They're fun. They don't have to be realistic. They have to be well made, and it's a whole different aesthetic. I had a line of dialogue in Tokyo SOS that was really an exciting day. It just was sort of happenstance. That was director Tezuka saying, Norman, oh my God, we need some foreigners for this scene. It was fine. It was fun, and I got my name in the credits. Finally, officially, after all the time I spent on the Millennium series. So for me, that's like my Millennium experience. The films themselves, really make up a very important chapter in my own personal life. So I might be kind of biased when comparing it to, say, the Heisei ones or even the Showa ones, which I had a purely fan point of view from.
So in 2004, Godzilla Final Wars officially closed out the Millennium Era, and Godzilla went into another hibernation for about a decade. But little did any of us know that in 2014, the franchise would be sent into a new era, or eras, that in my opinion, I would strongly argue that this is perhaps the most interesting time for Godzilla as a franchise. So in 2014, we got another big budget Hollywood Godzilla adaptation, again called Godzilla, but this time this movie was far better received than the one that happened in 1998. So much so that it actually kickstarted off a new Hollywood Godzilla franchise that has become known as the MonsterVerse. But check this out. Across the pond over in Japan, Toho Studios simultaneously also started making new Godzilla films on their own. These new movies are being labeled the Rewa Godzilla Era. It's pretty cool. We got two separate series eras kind of happening at the same time. And to further explain it, I reached out to my friends Yoko Higuchi and Ben Chaffins to talk about it further. Yoko is a New York-based filmmaker who also worked on 2016's Shin Godzilla, and Ben Chaffins is a staff writer for SciFiJapan.com, as well as the author of the upcoming book, Discovering Tokusatsu, interviews with the makers of Godzilla, Gamera, Ultraman, and other kaiju eiga.
The whole MonsterVerse era, we have gotten 3 movies, the 2 Godzilla movies and then Kong Skull Island, which have introduced newer generations of fans into the fandom. And while these movies are not critic acclaimed, they're fun for what they are.
MonsterVerse is that gateway opening for the Godzilla franchise for a newer audience, and also for audiences who haven't quite understood or have seen the franchise up to that point.
What I consider to be the most important of the 3 films so far, it's really hard to choose because each one is so unique and different from the other. But if I'm going to have to be completely honest, I would say Godzilla 2014 is probably the more important film, not only because it started the MonsterVerse, but with the political message that Gareth Edwards brought, came a little bit closer to what Ishiro Honda's messages were.
I do think Godzilla King of the Monsters, I think, is my pick for the most important. Godzilla 2014, as good of a film as it is, and as much as I like it, and it is very important because it reintroduced Godzilla into the modern age. However, I think that introducing the other Toho monsters was also extremely important because the 98 Godzilla happened, obviously it was a failure amongst other things, but I think American audiences are able to kind of grasp the concept of Godzilla. I think because Godzilla is such an iconic character internationally, and of course in the States, I think American audiences are okay with accepting Godzilla as a big movie monster. But I think it was harder to convince general movie audiences that Rodan, Mothra, King Ghidorah are also these giant creatures that deserve respect and integrity and all that kind of stuff. So I think that while 2014 is important for reintroducing Godzilla into the public mind, I think it's also even more important to open up the doors for Toho's Rogues Gallery of Kaiju, because I think for the life of me, I never thought that I'd see an American blockbuster starring King Ghidorah, Rodan, and Mothra. I thought that was impossible because I thought that the hunger and the want for those other kaiju were not. It wasn't there in America, at least unless it was it's just Godzilla. I think for me, I think most general movie audiences will pay to see a Godzilla film, but I wasn't entirely sure if audiences were accepting of seeing Godzilla fight Mothra or Rodan or King Ghidorah. So I think having King of the Monsters do that and showcase these incredible monsters and respect them the way that it did, I think that's why I consider King of the Monsters the more important film. While I do acknowledge that 2014 is also extremely important for bringing back the kaiju in the spotlight. So Godzilla over the years had since had different eras: Showa, Heisei, Millennium, and now the Rewa. And the Rewa era consists of Shin Godzilla and the anime trilogy as of right now, and whatever Toho decides to put out in the near future.
I think the importance of the Rewa era is knowing that Toho has taken such risks and pushing the envelope with what they can do with kaiju movie making in Japan.
I think, the Heisei films and the Millennium films, as much as, I love and enjoy them to various degrees, I think they haven't really invented things that broke the wheel in terms of what Godzilla can and cannot do, and not in terms of powers, but storytelling aspects. Godzilla represents allegorically and what Godzilla films can do in terms of their message, storytelling, visual language, all that kind of stuff. I think the Rewa films is doing that very, very well.
With Shin Godzilla, it was like the ultimate risk taker in a way, because while it did use traditional practical effects, Godzilla itself was entirely CGI. But to actually have Godzilla be full CGI throughout the entire movie, in Japan, mind you, is a huge feat and testimony to what they can actually do if they are given the time and the budget to work with this stuff.
So I was a production assistant on Shin Godzilla. I was in Toho Studios from, I believe, August to December in 2015. And it was such an incredible experience being a production assistant on Shin. Of course, it was a lot of, physical pain being a production assistant, just doing so many different things at one time and being on your toes for hours and hours and doing all these long shoots. But in the end, it was super rewarding. And I met so many great artists, just all around amazing people. I can't thank the crew enough for being so accommodating and being so open to having, I guess, honestly, a foreigner on set. Because I did ask a lot of questions. Obviously, I am of Japanese descent, but my Japanese fluency isn't all that great, and I can't read or write Japanese, so I was severely handicapped on set in that regard. And obviously, the work culture is very different from home, so I had to kind of like adjust myself quickly to these different kind of culture gaps that I had to kind of like overcome. And it even gave me even more respect for the Godzilla films than I already had. I think, of course, watching it, I knew that, these guys in these hot suits had to destroy buildings and they can't see, and it's these horrible conditions. And I knew all these things, but I think it's different when you actually are seeing these artists create all this stuff from scratch and having it be destroyed and the pressure of getting it done in one take. So now it gives me even more respect for these films than I already had, and to the filmmakers behind the camera who are just doing amazing work with these miniatures, and the artistry behind the camera is just so inspiring, and it's incredible. And and I'm so glad that the film turned out to be a fan favorite and also one of the best in the franchise. It won a lot of awards at the Japanese Academy Awards, and it looks like the Shin Godzilla design has been kind of like the new go-to look for Godzilla. They even have a statue of him now. So all of this hype and praise for Shin Godzilla, I'm just so blessed to be a part of the production, and I'm deeply humbled by everything. The Rewa Era is very important to introducing Godzilla to not only Japanese audiences but to international audiences, and I think Shin Godzilla was a great stepping stone for that, where they just began with a standalone film, and they were, I think, doing a lot of risks and gambling on certain creative ideas, especially in the anime trilogy.
Now, with the anime trilogy, this is the first animation Godzilla we've gotten considered anime from Japan. To see them actually play and continue to mess around with ideas to help keep Godzilla relevant and growing for each era, that's a testimony to itself. The importance of the Rewa films overall is to see what Toho is capable of doing with the kaiju genre. It's the pushing of the envelope. With Shin Godzilla, they took risks, and it paid off, at least in my opinion. To see them actually do something new and reinventing the wheel with what they can do with such an iconic character as Godzilla, that's a step in the right direction, in my opinion. And while they also played with those same aspects and risks that they took with Shin with the anime trilogy, while it may not have been executed the way it should have been, we can't deny the fact that they're trying something new and trying to make Godzilla as relevant as possible with each of these movies that they produce.
I think the Rewa Era is about taking the core concept of the character and the franchise and then updating it to modern standards with new state-of-the-art technology and filming techniques and storytelling techniques, and just in general updating the already 65-year-old franchise to something even greater. that it is right now. So it's about opening it up to international audiences and taking more risks in terms of the creative liberties.
This November will be Godzilla's 66th birthday, and what happens in the future is going to be anybody's guess, but I think that we can pretty much determine that Godzilla is going to be around for a while. Next year, we see Godzilla vs. Kong. That's going to be another entry in the MonsterVerse side of things. And even though nothing has formally or officially been announced, rumors persist that Toho, the Japanese studio who owns Godzilla, is going to be getting back into the King of the Monsters game with something. A new film, another anime movie, who knows? It's really exciting times, and I look forward to seeing what happens. Anyways, I would really like to thank my panelists, Norman, Patrick, Ben, and Yoko, for taking the time to talk to me for the purpose of this panel. And I would also like to thank all of you guys for sitting through this, and I really hope you guys learned a little something today. If you guys want more Godzilla goodness, you can follow me on YouTube under Monstrosities Tokusatsu Vlog, or on Twitter at Tokusatsu Vlog. And with that said, please, for Godzilla's sake, stay healthy, stay safe, and enjoy the rest of Nexus Con. Thank you so much.